What does a good death look like to you? What type of support do you want during that? And then even after life care, one thing that you talked about is bringing back in that ancient tradition and keeping people at home for death. And that death doula is that person that can really just support the family.
What's up, y'all? You are in for an absolute treat. Today, I had the absolute pleasure of speaking with Nicole Soares, who is an end-of-life educator and death doula. In this conversation, we touched on a bunch of different and very important topics. Nicole shared about how she helps people prepare before, during, and after the death and dying process, which I find totally fascinating, and I believe it's something that people should be more aware of and more prepared for. We also talked about psychedelics and the role that they can play in the end-of-life process. We also shared a little bit about our own personal stories and talked a little bit about reincarnation and all kinds of good stuff. So you're going to want to stick around for this one. Thank you so much for being here. And don't forget to head to aliwiv.com to see all the different goodies I've got there, free resources, all kinds of stuff. So without further ado, let's get into it. What's up, y'all? This is Ian with the After Life Insurance Podcast. And today I have a very special guest, Nicole Soares. Nicole is the founder of EcoLove Transitions. She is a death doula and an end-of-life educator. I have had the very good pleasure and I'm very grateful to have met Nicole. And I'm so thankful for the work that she does and how she supports people in the end-of-life process and the message that she has to share with the world. So yeah, Nicole, if you could be so kind as to share with the listeners and the people that are watching a little bit about your history, a little bit about how you got to be here, and yeah, what really drives you and what's exciting to you about doing this sort of work.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure getting to know you as well. It's so interesting how EcoLove Transitions even came about. I sold my financial services company about a little over a year ago, and I knew I wanted to take some time off. And I thought for sure, since I've been in financial services since I was 16 years old, I was going to start another business in financial services. And I had lots of great ideas and had been writing, thinking I was going down educational workshop route. And every time I'd sit down, nothing was flowing. I just couldn't get excited about it. I was so easily distracted and just really doing a lot of my own work around healing after my parents both passed away 2.5 years ago, just a couple weeks apart from COVID. I just really needed to process their death. And the more I did that, the more I realized their death, in my opinion, were both bad deaths. And I really thought people shouldn't have to go through this. And it just became more and more clear that was something that I could actually impact and help people prepare through the education, like you mentioned. End-of-life education really should happen at all ages. I know I shared with you, and I'm happy to share again, that I've been helping take care of my girlfriend who was in a tragic boat accident nearly 6 years ago. My age, healthy, beautiful, just fit. Why would she ever bother to have her medical wishes known? But when it came to the point that we had to make some really important decisions for her, we didn't know what her wishes were. So just being around these really tough, traumatic health issues, it just became more and more clear that this is something that I felt passionate about and really became the new direction on how I wanted to serve as well. So I'm really excited about it. It's super taboo. People don't want to talk about death. I remember I was going to have my very first death cafe, which is just a great little gathering that we host, Lisa, who's my business partner, and I. And it just gets people from our community together to sit down and just have an open dialogue around something that's very taboo, death, right? And the first one we advertised on Nextdoor, which was really helpful because there are a little different demographic on Nextdoor that really are starting to think about death. But we had such a great mix of ages. We even had children that showed up. But I run a meetup, and on my meetup, it's an adventure meetup. I went to my buddy who's the main administrator, and I said, "Hey, Big Al, I'm gonna I hold a lot of different events, concerts, but I said I'm gonna hold an event. It's called a Death Cafe." And he was like, "No, you cannot use the word death in the invite in the title. No way. You can say life, but you can't say death." And we really went back and forth. And I said, just let me try it. He's like, no, our population is not going to be interested. We had 3,600 people in our meetup and they were interested. He let me do it. And I was able to prove that people do want to talk about it and they need a safe place to do it. And so, yeah, it's really not an easy conversation for most people. But when you get them and you start answering questions, they really want to know answers. And I think the more we learn, the less anxiety we have around it. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's super important. And what you touched on there is having a safe environment and a safe space to have these conversations in. This concept of death cafe and death over dinner, you told me a little bit about these meetups you hold. I'm really curious, what's the format of these gatherings, and what kind of response are you getting from the people who are coming to these things to learn more about the death and dying process? And what are the main kind of questions that people have, and what are the things that come up most often?
Well, I want to share a story really quick. I have an old neighbor, a good friend of mine who has Parkinson's, and my age, young, healthy guy. So very shocking diagnosis for him. And it was maybe 6-9 months ago that he came to me. We have coffee occasionally. And he was telling me, I just don't think I want to live when these conditions exist, when I can't take care of my own hygiene or some basic needs. He is a single guy. And I remember just saying, oh, come on, that's not how you feel, and I really just didn't listen to him. I couldn't listen. It was so uncomfortable for me. And so many of the people that attend our death cafe or death dinner, one, a lot of them have faced with death, maybe not their own death. Some do come that are terminal or maybe have had illnesses in the past. But a lot of them have been in my shoes where they had a close family member, parent, or grandparent that's passed away. And they're not grief groups, right? We're not here to process grief per se. But at the same time, I think we're all grieving something every day, right? I think that's a part of life. And so what I found that people say they appreciate about these types of events, the Death Cafe and the Death Over Dinner events, is that they can just get all their questions answered, because we do have industry people there that are experts in aspects of death. And if we don't have the answers, we'd love to check and get back with people. It's attended not only by us, but even other death doulas or people from employees of hospice care, even medical associations. So it really is well attended by a nice, diverse group of experts, which has helped me improve my own knowledge. And they can come and they're not ignored. They're not told, don't say that, or that's not true. Or a lot of times people bring things up, they say, like, let's say with their own children, maybe it'll be a 78-year-old man or woman that have come, and there's quite a few couples that come, and they say, I'm trying to tell my daughter that this is what I want in this scenario, and they will not have that conversation with me. So it's really comfortable. We do provide in both of those environments, we provide refreshments and food, and Lisa makes them always look so beautiful. She's a florist and an event planner, and so she makes them extra special, which is fun. And she brings in ritual, which I really love. She's taking the time to really honor everybody that's showing up. During the Death Over Dinner event that we just did last week, she'd given everybody a rose, and we sat in the ritual, and that rose represented somebody in our life that we had lost. And we really sat with that rose, and she walked us through this experience. And then at the end, we went outside and we really just took the petals off in a very loving, honoring way, and really just each prayed on that rose and prayed on the person. And just these little things that Lisa does to bring in ceremony and rituals, especially even when somebody's actively dying, I think really brings a nice peace and calmness to the experience, so that the families that are left behind could have a beautiful memory of the space being held by us as death doulas, and about feeling like they weren't confused when the dying person was making certain noises or what was actually happening. So really just keeping that nice, beautiful, calm environment and walking them through as things are happening. That's normal and this is okay. And really holding that space and keeping everybody really just centered around being loved and staying in that loving thought rather than fear just helps that transition so much for the patient, but even the experience of all the loved ones that are left behind.
Yeah. Wow, that's super beautiful. I have to be honest, I got a little emotional as you were saying
Mhm.
that, thinking of the passing of my grandfather, which has been almost 25 years ago now. And I was
Oh,
pretty young when that happened. And it was a sudden traumatic event. And just thinking about how different my perception and like how
yeah.
different my memories would be of that situation had it been handled in more of a way that you described. It was very sudden and it was an accident. But yeah, it just thinking about the part that ritual does play in, especially in traditional situations, and like right now in our modern culture, I feel like we've become disconnected from death and the dying process. And I think for a lot of people, there's a hole that's left there. Like
Yeah.
somewhere in our deep unconscious minds, we recognize the importance of death and how special of an experience it is. There's a lot of challenging emotions that can come up during that process. And at the same time, it's an opportunity for an immense amount of growth,
Yeah.
and bringing ritual and ceremony back into that experience. I just feel it would have such a huge impact on the individual families, on the
Mhm.
person who's passing, and as well as just our culture as a whole. And
Yeah.
I'm really grateful that you're doing this work. And you mentioned earlier in our conversation before that there are three phases or different aspects to what you do. And I'm curious if you're able
Yeah.
to expand on that a little bit more.
The very first one is going back to my friend's situation, is really documenting the advance directive, which is also known as the living will, right? Regardless of your age and your health, just looking at your values, looking at your priorities, and making those decisions. In her situation, she had a major brain injury and they had to remove a golf ball size of her brain. The likelihood of her just having a healthy, independent life after that much of her brain and that section of her brain was removed was very slim. But in Arizona, which is where she lived, the hospital said, okay, we need one person that's going to be the designated conservator and guardian to make the decision as to are we putting this feeding tube in? Because once we put the feeding tube in, which is a life sustaining life support, which is one of the things that we document in the advance directive, then we can't take it out without a court order in the state of Arizona. We searched her house and unfortunately there was no advance directive. And I sure the heck hadn't thought about it for myself. So I didn't blame her in any way for not having one. I don't know too many 44-year-olds that do. But we made that decision. And at that point, I was asked to become her conservator and guardian. And so making those decisions for difficult decisions like that, as well as all the decisions over the last 6 years, have been really challenging because I didn't know what her wishes were. So for me, providing that first phase of our services is really the end of life education, getting people to understand about the advance directive, helping them actually fill it out and understand when you check this box what that really is saying. And you're not just saying, I never want life sustaining services. I don't want a feeding tube or I don't want to be resuscitated. You can say that you want certain things in certain conditions for a certain amount of time. Like, I'm willing to try this for up to 7 days. And if there's no benefit, then at that point, I'd like that to be stopped. And so, just a wonderful, very simple couple page document that everybody can, but it requires conversation. It requires understanding, right? And so it's not just a matter of filling something out because once it's done, it's communicating it to my adult daughter, who is my healthcare agent, who I've asked if that's something she's willing to do. And then I documented it in that advance directive. So really just the education and the education is so much broader too, because we also go into decisions like what does a good death look like to you? What type of support do you want during that? And then even after life care, one thing that you talked about is bringing back in that ancient tradition and keeping people at home for death. As an example, we look at the locations, right? Nearly
Mhm.
80% of people die in a hospital today. It's the last place most people say they want to die. In surveys, 70-80% of people want to die at home. But guess what happens when something happens at home? They, even though they're terminal, a family calls 911 because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to handle that situation. They don't know how to watch their loved one die. And so having a death doula that's be there, which is really that second part of the service, which is that dying support, right? I don't know why I'm not even all that sporty when it comes to watching sports, but I just kind of go to the quarterback, right? It's like the
Hmm.
person that death doula is that person that can really just support the family. They work closely with hospice and palliative care teams. They can bring in holistic solutions, even psychedelics. If somebody's really struggling with acceptance of their terminal diagnosis. There's so many beautiful things that as a doula, we can sit back and see, hey, I really think this patient might benefit from this, or even a family member would benefit from this. We look at celebration of life and legacy projects.
It's so important to have somebody who is, in a sense, not emotionally attached to the situation to be able to make decisions and to be predetermined as the person that's going to make decisions. Because in those end-of-life scenarios, there's a lot of emotions that come up for everybody involved. And I think we're all very aware that and somebody who's in a really highly charged emotional state often isn't in the best state to be making decisions. And that's something
I'd be careful about saying that we make decisions, because what we're generally doing is we've already had those conversations with the dying person, and we're really helping honor the decisions that they've made. And we're just really keeping the family, because unfortunately the family comes in and they often don't agree with that decision. And if this person is now unable to speak for themselves, we really just help advocate. We hold space. That's really what's important. We have to meet the patient where they are. And I can tell you that's really challenging at times. Everybody is coming into this terminal diagnosis in such different ways, and many don't accept it. Many are angry. Many stay in that just the unhealthy phases of grief, and that's okay. But it's really just honoring them and supporting them and trying to get the family, when they show up, just to be present and be loved and to honor them, because they're coming in all anxious and stressed. And so we can just hold space and keep everybody together in a nice way.
Thank you for that clarification. And you're not making decisions for somebody. You're helping to execute the decision that was made by the person that had been communicated with you ahead of time.
Right.
And doing that from a space of, from a place of not being in a heightened emotional state, I'm sure is very settling for the family in some way, knowing that aspect is taken care of by somebody who that's their role. And that gives the family the opportunity to grieve and experience whatever they're experiencing without the additional duty of having to also make sure everything is done correctly.
Yeah, I would say for me personally, that part of the job is the most important and also one of the most difficult. But I will say that having a partner, Lisa, we're companion care, and that part of it is just so innate in who she is. That's why I love this partnership, because we are two very different people bringing different skill sets to this work. And I'm just grateful that's something, that holding space. And like I said, the ritual, she's just beautiful at that. She's wonderful. So I'm learning, and there's times I am assisting and there's times I'm leading. And that's an area that I'll be completely honest. And maybe my death is still so close and so raw with both my parents, and the family dynamics because of religion and politics and all of these things going through that, where it's just so difficult. I know how difficult it can be, and I want to do everything I can to avoid that. And I know we're set up to really provide that service. And right now I'm doing it more in an assisting role, and watching and observing and learning from her, and continuing to do my own work, my own grief work. Yeah, it's a process.
Yeah. And I spent a lot of time over the last few years in psychedelic ceremonies, and death is a motif that comes up frequently. People are constantly being forced to look at their own mortality. And and being able to hold that space for people is, it's not necessarily an intuitive thing. I think for some folks it is, but there's also an aspect of learning how to deal with people when they're in that state. And there's an aspect of just consciousness expansion, like thinking thoughts you've never thought of before, looking at things from a completely different lens that requires a certain kind of gentleness and being willing and able to handle those situations.
Psychedelics has been huge for me too. I'm glad you brought that up, because I would just add to what you said, that what it's really done for me is help quiet my ego and open my heart. And that's what's really been a big part of my healing process. And it's something that I wish legally we had more ability to provide to our patients and their families. There are things like ketamine and even cannabis that we can leverage now. And that's what we do through one of our partnerships, which you and I both know, Aaron. And so we can see when somebody's stuck. We can see when they're stuck in their past identity and this attachment and this inability to let go, and bringing that in just a one couple hour session can just be so profound in how they move forward with the whole dying process. So I know over time it's going to get better and more things will become legalized so that we can leverage it even more. But it's, for me personally, it was my biggest part of my opening heart journey and getting to this point where I knew it was something that could be beautiful.
So I'm glad you brought up the area of psychedelics in work with end of life and in this general capacity, because I've done a lot of work with psychedelics and have helped facilitate a lot of those kind of ceremonies. And quite frankly, I thought at some point in my journey that I would be helping assist people with end of life using psychedelics.
Mhm.
So I'm really curious as to your thoughts on that, and
Yeah.
where you think that psychedelics play the greatest role and what their place is in that end of life process.
I feel like there's two ways I believe psychedelics are best used in end of life. One is right after that terminal diagnosis, when the doctor says to you, go home, get your affairs in order. There's really no other treatments we can do. And again, we don't know if it's 1 week they have or 2 years. It's irrelevant. It's the acceptance of that terminal diagnosis is one of the biggest challenges for a lot of people. And so really working on opening the heart, quieting the ego, the acceptance, letting go of those identities because they might be transitioning. I just read the most beautiful book, When Breath Turns to Air. I think it was a neurosurgeon who found out he had lung cancer, and often lung cancer then spreads to the brain. And so the types of surgeries he was resolving for all these years, which are brain tumors and brain cancers, as an example, he ended up with. And he really struggled. He'd spent all these years, he was just in his late 30s, all of these years working towards becoming a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist, and to only find out before he ever really even is able to officially like finish his residency and become a doctor, he has this terminal diagnosis. And so letting go of the identity and then figuring out like how did he want to spend his final days, because it was such a challenge for him to just spend 30 hours in surgery on a given day, which sometimes that's what you'd have to do. He physically couldn't anymore. He was too ill. And so really just shedding those identities, but letting go of those attachments and things are so challenging. So for me, the acceptance part is huge and can be really beneficial. I think especially because for me, and tell me what you think, I feel like psychedelics takes something that we probably would get to eventually and just expedites it, right? And some people will say it's like 7 or 10 years of therapy in one
Mm,
session, right? So they don't have
mm.
7 to 10 years per se. They've got to process this and accept it if they're going to choose to in this lifetime. They've got to do it quickly. What do you think of that?
There's this running joke in the ayahuasca community that ayahuasca ceremony is just dress rehearsal for death. I found that to be personally true, and I've
Yeah.
witnessed that with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And the ability of these different plant medicines, whether it's ayahuasca or psilocybin specifically,
Mhm.
those are the first two that come to mind because the psychoactive component of each of those medicines are very similar. You know,
Yeah.
the experience is somewhat different, but there's a
Mhm.
lot of overlap
Yeah.
in both the ayahuasca and the psilocybin experience.
Right.
And the ability for those medicines to allow, and from my perspective and the way I perceive it and experience it, is that through whatever mechanism, however these medicines are working in our system, they allow our consciousness, which is
Mhm.
usually we're very used to being inside of our body and that our point of view is from behind our eyes. We're very
Right.
associated with our physical form.
Mhm.
And these medicines create almost like a slipperiness. So where our consciousness can exit that space that it's very
Yeah.
accustomed to being in.
Yeah.
And when you do that at a high enough dose of these medicines, and you're able to have new sense perceptions, and the sense perceptions that you had are heightened, or
Yeah.
you're able to, time gets really wonky in that space. And
Yeah.
the past doesn't seem so far away, and the future doesn't seem so far away. It's a really unusual state to be in of consciousness. And quite frankly, in the way that I look at it, that's fundamentally what happens at the end of our life when we die. Our
Yeah.
body ceases to work, and our spirit, our soul, call it whatever the animating energy of our self is
Right.
liberated from the body. The difference with the psychedelic is that at a certain point, your consciousness becomes localized within your body again, and you come back down and come to earth, so to speak. And at the end of your life, your consciousness goes on a different journey. It's very analogous, those experiences in some way. And once you have that experience and you realize just because your consciousness isn't necessarily associated with your body doesn't mean that you end. That's a directive experience of the fact that we're greater than our physical experience. And I think that they can alleviate a lot of questions and uncertainty for people.
Yeah, I love all that. The one thing I feel like at end of life, I really would define as like a good death, somebody who's really doing this work and the letting go is also the forgiveness work, forgiving themselves, not holding on to regrets, forgiving others, saying I'm sorry, saying thank you, I love you. All those things that sometimes they're really hard for people to say and do for whatever reason, right? It was hard for me and my parents, I'll admit. I wish I got to hear that, and I wish I would have been able to say that. Unfortunately, it wasn't, but I get to say it now after the fact, and I feel connected to them. I often say more now than I did then. So I feel like it helps walk you through that journey and understanding and letting go and forgiving, so that when you come out of that medicine work, you can actually then express yourself and to the people that you want to express to. For whatever reason, that wall comes down. I feel like that openness and that heart connection is there. So I think that's so beautiful. You and I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, and I loved geeking out over it. So I'd love to spend time on it now too. So we're in California. I'm in California, and we have medical aid in dying, also known as dying with dignity. California is one of 10 states that allow people that are terminal, that meet certain conditions, to go and get 2 doctors' signatures at least 24 hours or 48 hours apart, and they can get the prescription that would then allow them to end their life. And I think of it almost like a cesarean section, right? In the sense that you're already dying, you're dying, and you have chosen to end your suffering. And maybe it's because you don't want to let go of control and you're going to choose your death date. And maybe it's because the financial burden is too great. There's so many different reasons why people choose this path. But at that point, they're just heavily medicated through that death process. And so the question is, if we could use psychedelic with maybe VSED, which is voluntary stop eating and drinking, which generally our body will shut down in 7 to 14 days and will naturally die without being heavily medicated at that point. The question is, let's say we could go psychedelics with VSED. What would that experience be like versus dying with this heavy medicine? How does it impact our soul transitioning? And of course, we don't know all those answers, but I'll tell you, I love to read about death these days as I continue to build my practice. So many spiritual books that I'm reading, whether it be Buddhist or Hindu or Christianity. Well, no, we'll leave Christianity out of that part of it, but so many of them really talk about the importance of not, like, for example, the gurus, when they die, they just run off to a cave or walk off to a cave and they die alone, right? So some believe we should die alone. And some people believe we should feel the suffering at the end. We should feel the pain at the end. That's part of the process of death and not be so heavily medicated. So again, could we use even cannabis? Could we use opening people's minds to that? When we're dealing with all these families that come in and look at it and see it as a drug, just like I just want to use cannabis gummies to help ease the pain and suffering and allow them to be present and joyful at that end of moment or that end of life during those moments, rather than giving them these heavy drugs, which are legal and wonderful. And I think I'm glad we have access. It is something I ponder.
Yeah, it's a very individual thing for each person, and it's going to be really based on that person's values and beliefs.
Right.
And one thing when it comes to a terminal diagnosis, or even somebody who's without a terminal diagnosis who's decided that they want to end their life, in my personal experience and I was a dialysis technician for a period of time, so I worked with people who were terminally ill.
Yeah.
And people who are nearing the end of their lives. I watched many patients that I'd become close with go through that process. And I've known quite a few people who, for whatever reason, they were thinking that they maybe didn't want to be alive anymore. And through my own personal experience and having had the psychedelic experiences of leaving my body and coming back and leaving my body and coming back, it's like, for me, it's very clear. It's like wherever you go, there you are. The problems that I experience in my life ceases. The problems don't necessarily go away. There's an aspect of myself that has manifest these problems in my life such that I can learn and grow and move on to the next lesson. So I look at the problems of life and the challenges as opportunities for growth.
Right.
And I think the same can be said for the circumstances surrounding the end of someone's life. While, yes, it is possible to potentially be heavily sedated and go through that process in a very unconscious way. I study Tibetan Buddhism, and certain sects of Tibetan Buddhism consider the end of your life to be the most important moment of your life, and that your whole life is a preparation for death, such that when you make that transition, and the belief is that the smoother that you can make that transition, with the least amount of fear, the least amount of anxiety, the more prepared you can go into that, the cleaner that transition can be. And the more of the lessons that you learned in this life, you'll be able to maintain on to the next part of your journey, such that you won't have to relearn those lessons.
I love in Walking Each Other Home, which is Ram Dass's last book that he co-wrote. He says, and it might have been a podcast. I can't recall if it was in this book, actually, because I've been really geeking out over Ram Dass lately. But he said his friend came to him that I believe they had paralysis or something for 20 years. And he said, Ram Dass, I think I'm ready. I think I'm done. And he goes, what do you think about that? And Ram Dass goes, well, I think you're still alive for a reason. I still think you have work to do, but you can do it in this lifetime or you can do it in the next lifetime. I'm not here in judgment. You decide what you want to do. I'll honor whatever your wishes are, but you asked my opinion and I think you're alive for a reason and you can do it now or you can do it next time. I just love that. But the other thought that came up for me is I remember my mom in particular, both my parents, being that they both died at the end of COVID, they had comorbidities, but they died of COVID. Each of them required a high amount of oxygen in order to live. And so for them, the decision for my mom in particular was turn off the oxygen and fill her with morphine and then naturally she'll stop breathing. Well, looking back now, which was such a challenging thing to sit and watch, but I think they do that for the family. I don't think they do that for the dying person, right? It's because to speed up the process for us, so we're not sitting there for many hours or we're not having to listen to her gurgle and listen to the actual active dying process that I so much understand now and honor and find it to be beautiful. And it's sad that we go that route in the hospital in order to help alleviate the suffering for the family.
Yeah, and that period of my time where I was a dialysis technician, that was a very challenging period of my life, personally, and just working in that space, because I was able to witness firsthand how the families played such a big role in the decisions that were made for their loved one that was on dialysis and at the end of their life. And it became abundantly clear to me that there were certain people who just continue to come to dialysis, which is it's gnarly. On one hand, it gives people more time with their family. On the other hand, it is very challenging and depleting for the individual. And I was able to witness people who are ready to go, and
they're pressured by their families to keep doing it. Yeah, it's not what they want.
And sometimes those people at the end of your life, some of your decision-making abilities and some of your faculties are not as strong as they used to be.
Yeah.
So they just agree with whatever the family members around them would suggest that they do. And so having these conversations earlier on so that when people get to that point, that there's a clear understanding of what's to be done and we don't have to try to figure it out or see what we should do in that moment. Like we're going into it with a game plan and knowing what the person's wishes are and had been all along. It's just so vitally important and meaningful for that process.
Right. Right. And again, that's the key role of the death doula, is to just give them a voice, support them, let the family know how important it is to honor that. But I'll tell you, I've been in situations where even the doctors are frustrated that they're giving up, that there is something else we can do, even if we just buy a little bit more time. The doctors don't want to, their metric of success is keeping people alive. And the amount of testing that they do at the last hour on people that are terminally ill, that are dying, just to give them one more day. And that's where we have to go back to our values. Is it our quality of life that really matters? And what does our quality of life mean to us? What's important to us? The doctors will default to doing what they do, which is keep you alive at all costs. And when people are on Medicare, as an example, and they're aging, Medicare can't review the chart. So if the doctors are saying, let's try this and let's do this and let's run this test, and they're running the patient all over the place, and it's chaos and there's alarms and there's sound, it's not calming, it's not nurturing, but they do it because that's what they're trained to do. And so it's not only our families, it's just this lack of acceptance by all people involved in this process that's so frustrating to watch.
Yeah, I witnessed it firsthand. It's a systematic issue.
Right.
The system is not set up in such a way where the intention or the focus is not honoring the individual and making sure that the most comfortable, as comfortable as they can be. That's not the metric for success.
Right.
Longevity is the metric for success, regardless of the quality of life during that time, quite often. And I think that's really unfortunate. And my hope is that these conversations will get people thinking about what they want the end of their life to be like. And as you said, what's really important, the quality of life or the quantity of life.
Right.
And that's something that each individual person is going to have to come up with on their own. And ultimately, I think we're all responsible for making our wishes known. We can't just rely on the people around us to be able to read our minds, or even our closest loved ones, to know exactly what we want to have done and how to do it. So
yeah.
You mentioned there was 3 parts. I think we talked about 2 parts.
I think I've done 2. Yeah. So the first is the education. The second is the dying support. And the third one is the combination of everything that happens after death. It's the after death care. And that's really bringing that ancient tradition back into the environment, to work with the family, to wash the body, to honor the body with ritual and ceremony, clean it, keep that body there for even days. It doesn't have to be removed from the house right away. Now, that's where hospice is really important, because when somebody dies under hospice care at home, then they're pronounced dead, but then the body can stay. If they're not on hospice, then it becomes a crime scene, right? It becomes like an autopsy has to be done. And so I just want to do a little plug for hospice at this point, because when somebody is at the end of their life, it's such a beautiful resource that we can leverage to provide pain management. They provide grief support for the patient and their family. They provide support for the caregivers. They come in and do the hygiene and the bathing. There's so many things that hospice can be leveraged for, but so many people have this thought of what hospice means that they don't enact hospice. Hospice can be enacted up to 6 months, like the point when they think you have about 6 months or less. On average, people are dying of less than 14 days of hospice care, less than 21 days of hospice care. Hospice in the home environment is awesome if we can keep people at home. Even in a nursing home or hospital, hospice can be used. We used hospice for my mom at the end in a hospital setting because we couldn't move her because of the amount of oxygen her body required. So there's reasons sometimes they don't leave the hospital, but we were able to take my father by ambulance and honor his request to die at home with hospice. So that was lovely, considering. And I guess the thought now that's coming up and distracting me is the home environment. It is so expensive for people at the end of their life. Most people haven't even properly saved for retirement, let alone their end of life care. And the financial burden that's put on the family members at the end is huge. It's not just the patient. A lot of times the patients ran out of money at the end of life, and their caregivers and their family are all pitching in, and it's thousands and thousands of dollars. Doesn't even account for any of the ceremonial things that, whether we want to do a celebration of life or a memorial, a cremation, the body disposition, things like that. So one is trying to honor the request of most people, which is 70-80% of people from surveys result in saying they'd like to die in a home environment. Being able to keep them in home and honor that body and allow viewing and support there, I think, is something that, is really important to Lisa and I. And as death doulas, we provide that support And really, it's about supporting the family through that process. Unless the family doesn't want to be involved, and then we provide the whole service, and that's totally fine. We don't have a preference one way or the other. I do think, though, I do have a preference. My preference is that they are involved because it does help with them grieving. There's an acceptance of death that happens when you honor your loved one by cleaning them and supporting that process. So I think it's great when people can do it, but I have no judgment if they choose not to. And then really being involved in the body disposition. So I'm in the final process of becoming a funeral director. And the reason that is important is because then we can get more involved in the transportation and the body disposition. I personally believe that the soul is separated from the body at death or about the time of death. There's some lingering, is kind of what I'm understanding, but I love the idea of donating the body to science. UCSD here in San Diego has a beautiful donation service where they use that body, they embalm the body, and they keep that body for medical students to teach and help save lives in the future. And matter of fact, in 2024, this year, June 2nd, they do a beautiful memorial for all the bodies that were donated up at, I believe, at Scripps Pier area. And so Lisa and I will be attending that, which will be our first time, which I'm really excited about. I love that they do the honoring and all the family and friends can come out and participate in that beautiful memorial. And the beauty of that is there's no cost. You donate the body, there's no cremation cost. But if you want the ashes, which we got for my parents, and I love having them because when I go on road trips, I take my mom's ashes and my dad's ashes and I spread them during my honoring process of being in nature and thinking, wow, I think this is something my mom, she would have loved to have been here with me, or this is a hike my dad would have loved to have done with me. And I'll sit in meditation and prayer and I'll spread some ashes and send love. So I do love having the ashes, which is great. But if that's not important to some people, then I love the idea of the donation. But going to disposition, I love water cremation. It's still kind of a new concept. We have 2 years ago in California, the very first water crematory was implemented, and it's actually right here in Escondido, California, so very close to where I live. Since then, there's been 2 open up in the San Francisco Bay Area, but it is 90% more eco-friendly. So remember, our name is EcoLove Transitions. What we're really going to do is to get the word out about things that are eco-friendly around death, whether it be eco-friendly urns or eco-friendly body disposition. And so this old school fire process, it just puts toxins in the air, and it's just a very outdated way of disposing of a body. And so the water cremation uses alkaline hydrolysis, and that liquid, which is 95% water, breaks down the soft tissue. And what you're left with in this capsule at about 4 hours for this particular center in Escondido is the bones. They take and dry out those bones, and then they grind them down to ash. And you end up with the same kind of end product, which is the ashes that you could put in an urn. So I'm really excited about getting that out there. When I talk more and more about it, nobody knows what I'm talking about. I will tell you, sometimes I've heard about it for pets, though. That is a little more common. Matter of fact, it started in the 1990s after mad cow disease. And I guess because when you burn carcasses, the toxins still get emitted, even the disease and certain toxins, which I'm not an expert in this. I hope I'm not saying it wrong, but it supposedly can get emitted and spread. And so this is one of the cleanest ways. And the byproduct is a bunch of liquid, I believe 400 gallons of liquid. And that just gets cleaned and put right into our water system. It's actually really clean. And in some states, we can capture it and give it back to the families, and they put it in their forest and on their land, and it's nutrient rich. But in California, we're not allowed to. So it just gets cleaned and put into the water system, which most people may not like the idea of that, but it is actually, it's nutrient rich and it doesn't harm anything.
Oh my gosh, of all the things that are already in our water systems, if there's pushback on that, I think people really need to take a deeper look at what's going on. I have to admit, I'm up until this point, that was a totally new concept for me. I'm totally ignorant about the water cremation, and I find it fascinating, and it makes total sense. The mad cow disease, what causes it is our prions, these really tightly wound proteins that are in the brain tissue, and that and they don't break down in heat very well because they're so dense. That makes total sense.
You described that beautifully. Now that you say it like that, that's exactly what I read. Yes.
So that makes perfect sense as to why people have come up with a water process. And the fact that it's so ecologically friendly is really beautiful. And for me, there's something soothing about water, and thinking that someone's remains will be dealt with or just broken down through a process of using fluid. It's a totally new concept to me, and one that as you talked about it, I was like, man, I hope this catches on. It seems like there are a lot of potential upsides to this without negative or potentially damaging byproducts. That's super cool.
I think it has to. I think it's just a matter of time. It's just so new. And I read an article in South Africa, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, believe it was 2 years ago, about the same time our Aqua-cremation center opened, used water cremation for his body disposition. And that was really the first big human use of it, and really became something that certain religious beliefs, because there are certain religions that are really proponents for the physical burial of the body. And then there's some that actually are very, even Eastern cultures, that really believe in the fire burning of the body. And so it's challenging some religious norms as well to get people to think of, being that it is eco-friendly, is this something that should and can be acceptable for them, and is it in alignment with what their beliefs are? And I hope it is. I think that's going to take some time.
Yeah. And regardless of what someone chooses, I think it's really important to have options and to have informed consent, and for someone to be able to lay out, hey, these are all your options. And if you choose option A, this is the outcome. If you choose option B, this is the outcome. If you choose option C, this is the outcome. And really give people the opportunity to honor their own beliefs and their own values. That's, again, I think that's paramount. And giving somebody those options leading up to the point, at whatever point, maybe they make these decisions when they're younger.
Right.
Maybe they make them closer to the end of their life. But the person having those options and knowing that they're not just going to get stuck in a box and filled with chemicals and then just put in a cemetery somewhere, like that is going to play a role and have an impact on someone's level of comfort, knowing that they got to choose and they know what's going to happen with their body at the end. And I think a lot of the anxiety that surrounds the death process, if we can start to give people more options and more education and more information about that process ahead of time, it starts to slowly peel back the layers of, like, rather than thinking that everything is totally out of your control, you can start to take more responsibility for that, for the end of your life. And that by default will start to alleviate some of the anxiety around it.
I agree. Yeah. And I think just having those answers documented, again, in advanced directives and pulse and different documentation, having it really documented and sharing and communicating, just that control is just so important, that they have choices, right? And they have affordable choices, because there are people that are on a budget. And I know you and I have talked about funeral insurance, as end-of-life funeral insurance, which is a beautiful way that people can have these things taken care of financially, so that they're not passing on the burden of burying them and taking care of these things on their behalf. It can be, if you're going to have a service, it could be upwards of $10,000, $15,000 by the time you do the cremation and the service. So it's important that if you can afford to, and you alleviate that anxiety for the family, I think it's important to a lot of people that I talk to, that they make those decisions and that they get the insurance or set up a bank account where those funds are available so that it can be taken care of.
Yeah. And again, I'm right there with you. And that's one of the reasons why I got into the life insurance business, is because I truly believe that the end of our lives is one of the most important, if not the most important, event in our life. And whatever we can do, whatever proactive actions we can take earlier on in our life that can allow us to, like you said, have everything taken care of ahead of time, whether that's through final expense insurance, whether that's through a life insurance policy, whether that's through, like you said, like a bank account, a savings account that's specifically set up for that, or making arrangements with the funeral home ahead of time, whatever that looks like, being able to just to have that experience as consciously as possible with all the family members is going to really make a big difference in that person's, not only the end of their life, but everybody in the family. That's going to have an impact on family members down the road. And you can't really put a price tag on
The
on that
peace of mind.
experience.
The
Yeah,
peace of mind.
yep, the peace of mind that is available for people if they take the steps ahead of time and they're proactive
Yeah.
when it comes to addressing these topics that can be challenging to look at. On the other hand, they're there. Like we're all at some point in time.
It's gonna happen.
Like it's a cliche saying, but it's true. Nobody gets out alive.
Yeah.
And and I think of all the different wisdom traditions that I've studied. I'm a certified yoga teacher, and at the end of every yoga class, you do shavasana, which is corpse pose. So it's just a subtle reminder that, like, oh yeah, corpse pose.
I've never heard of it being referred to as corpse pose. I never heard that. I love it.
Yeah, that's the translation. The Sanskrit
Okay.
translation of shavasana is corpse.
Good to know.
So, shavasana is corpse pose, quite literally translated.
Yeah.
And that's an opportunity for people to think about it, to connect with that inevitability. The Stoics, they talk about memento mori, meditate on your death. It's one of their kind of core foundational principles. Get familiar with thinking about your death because it's coming. Get ready for it.
Yeah.
The Tibetan Buddhist tradition as well. It's very focused on preparation for death. And I just know that at some point there's going to be, hopefully it's many years down the road for me, that I will be in a situation where I float up out of my body and I look down from a different vantage point. My body's dead, and hopefully there are going to be a lot of lovely friends and family members and people surrounding me going through that process. And I just know I'm going to look down and there will be nothing more that I could do from that place. I'll be beginning the next part of my journey, whatever exactly that looks like. It's hard to say. And there will be nothing that I can do from that vantage point. And I want to be in that place and know that I did everything possible to support not only myself in that process, but the people around me and all my loved ones and all the people who are observing. And I truly see preparing for our deaths as an act of self-love, being able to give ourselves that gift of doing whatever we can to achieve that peace of mind so we can actually have peace in that moment and make it a smooth and easier transition without as much anxiety and stress as we can.
Well, what it makes me think of is you really start thinking about death and planning for death. It just makes you show up so much more differently today. The way you live is so differently. It's the work that we do today really is what sets us up for a good death. Truly. It's the letting go of attachment. It's loving everybody. It's staying out of judgment. It's all the things that we practice today that really prepares us. And I think it's become more and more apparent for me the more I study death and the more I'm involved in death. The work I do today is what matters.
That's really well put and beautifully said. And that work can be different things. That work can look differently for different people, and that can kind of shift over time.
Yeah.
It could be doing like meditating on your death, like the Stoics. It could be reading books about it. It could be having these conversations with family members. It could be getting your medical directive done. It could be getting your will and final testament. It could be making that monthly payment for the premiums for your life insurance policy. I think it could be any of those things. We can turn this to a conscious practice of connecting with that knowing, like, oh, this is only temporary and right now is all we have. So make the most of it, prepare for what's coming, and make the most of what's right here with us right now.
Yeah. I think the word that comes to me is intentional, like living intentionally. And all of those things that you mentioned, I think are part of living intentionally. And yeah, there's going to be different ebbs and flows and things that are part of your daily routine today that are going to evolve tomorrow. And that's great. And some things won't be important to some people, and that's okay too. But it really is a journey. And I'm just so grateful. I'm really grateful for the psychedelics because for me, my whole life has completely changed. Like I started psychedelic work with a girlfriend that is a very shaman-like person. I played volleyball with her. I knew she was special. I didn't know exactly what she was into, but I just remember talking to her within like a couple of days after my mom died. My dad died, and then 4 or 5 weeks later, my mom died. And I just remember thinking, I'm really struggling. And it was either anxiety medication. I needed something. I just was so lost. I didn't know who to talk to. That's a whole nother thing. When you're grieving, a lot of people don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to show up for you. You don't know, you push people away. Like, I'll take responsibility for my part in that too. She said, well, let's do a mushroom journey. I had no idea what mushrooms were. I had no idea. Like, my world did not involve any type of drug or psychedelic. I literally had the most beautiful conversations with my mom and my dad after they died. And interesting enough, two other friends that had passed away within the prior year or two also came through in that journey. And I was just blown open. I was raised in this religious, but I'm going to use the word cult because it is by definition. I moved out of my house at 16. I wasn't allowed to live at home anymore. My dad said, if you're not going to go and participate in our religion, then you're not welcome in my home. And so with that religion, they didn't save for retirement. Armageddon was coming. The world was coming to an end. I don't know how many times it was inevitable. Armageddon was coming. So I didn't know that the spirit lived on. Like, matter of fact, I hated God. I'll say that, like, truly, I hated God. Anytime somebody talked about religion, I ran. But that day, I had a direct connection with God. I had a deep understanding that our souls lived on. And it was just one of the most profound days of my life. And done other medicine work since, and ayahuasca and all these beautiful, amazing things that have just deepened this love for God and deepened this connection to this higher source. Just a deep understanding of the afterlife in my beliefs. And I'm just so grateful for it. Yeah.
It sounds like your religious upbringing was significantly more strict and structured than mine, but I also had a similar kind of orthodox religious upbringing.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say that I hated God per se, but that the things I was forced to do when I was really young pushed me to the opposite end of the spectrum. And in my 20s, I was nearly a militant atheist. I was not interested in having conversations about God. Just get that away from me. Don't waste my time with that. That's just where I was. And until I had a near-death experience, and it became abundantly clear to me in a split second that there was something going on that I could not explain through science. And that was December 30th of 2011. I had a near-death experience that completely changed the trajectory of my life. And I think
that's amazing. I definitely want to hear about that. You haven't shared that before.
It's something that just doesn't come up in a normal conversation all that often. I'll put it that way. But oh man, it's a long story. I was in the healthcare industry, working middle management in a Fortune 500 company, working my way up the corporate ladder, and completely miserable. And I was very active. I was doing competitive Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I got a staph infection, and I got very sick. And I ended up being on a medication. I was put on a medication that was supposed to make me better, and it caused a perforation in my large intestine, and I nearly bled to death from internal bleeding. And I'd been bleeding all day. I didn't know what was going on. I went to work. I worked. I didn't know what to do, except what I'd always done is just go to work and get the job done. And I stopped at an urgent care on my way home, and I told the person at the urgent care what had been happening, and they said, go to the emergency room right now. Okay. So I stopped by my apartment, changed, and I laid down on my bed. And I was so tired. I'd lost, I don't know how much blood throughout the day. Laid down on my bed, and I just needed a second to rest. And I closed my eyes, and I started to doze off. And it was like a gunshot went off in my head. I heard the voice that said, get up.
Wow.
And my eyes shot open. I looked around. There was nobody there. I got up. I grabbed my bag. I went to the hospital, and whoever that was, whatever that was.
Wasn't your time to go.
It wasn't my time to go. And I know that if I had fallen asleep, I would not have woken up.
Unbelievable.
And, it wasn't like an out-of-body near-death experience, but I knew had that, whatever that intervention was, had that not happened, I would have not woken up.
Yeah.
So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you go back through that at all, processing that through psychedelics at any time?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. I'm a Taurus born in the year of the ox, so I'm double stubborn, so I needed a very strong motivation or a very strong sort of wake up call to
Yeah.
to get me out of what I was doing that wasn't satisfying or fulfilling me. And
Yeah.
it was I say it was the best, worst thing that ever happened to me, that whole experience. My whole life got flipped upside down. It was exactly what I needed and brought me
Mhm.
to, in a roundabout way, to where I am here today. So
Yeah.
in that moment, everything about what I believed about everything changed. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, there's something going on. And that's what propelled me onto the spiritual path that I've
Yeah.
been on, and all the exploration that I've been doing, and just this fascination with death and what does it mean? How can we grow from it? What
Sure.
happens afterwards? What happens? Just all the things. Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
I was not expecting to go there. And
I
so,
love reading the near-death experiences and so many of the writings and books that I've been reading. It's so beautiful and profound. And when I started, I hated God. The God that my parents really showed me, especially my father, was just didn't feel like a loving God. It was a lot of hypocrisy and judgment and shame and not enoughness and not feeling safe and always fearing the world coming to an end. And if I didn't do this and this, I was not going to be one of the chosen ones, or I wasn't going to be resurrected. And it's just it's a lot for a little kid to live that way. And it's so funny now. I ask myself in so many situations, like, how are you feeling, Nicole? Like when I'm trying to make a decision, what's my gut telling me? Like, what in the inside, if I sit in meditation, what am I being told is right for me? I don't think anyone ever asked me, like, how am I feeling or what makes you happy? It was like, no, this is how you're going to do it. This is what's going to make you happy. And this is what's going to make God happy. So I lived that way until my mid 40s. And sometimes I remember when I first was exposed to medicine and I had this awakening, I was like, how did it take me so long? In fact, in ayahuasca, my very first night in ayahuasca, there was this huge celebration. All these people showed up for me. A lot of people had passed on, some people that were in my life currently, people that I lost touch with. Everybody was there and they're like, they were all on this stage and I was sitting by myself in like an auditorium and they're like, oh, finally you're here. We knew you'd make it. But it was like this understanding, this deep love, like, finally, yes, we're here. We're here to celebrate you. You made it. I just everything from the past just didn't matter anymore. I just felt so loved and so like this is my path. And I haven't looked back. It's the spiritual path for me. And then understanding and applying what I'm learning around death, what happens after we die, the reincarnation and all that just gives me so much more hope. And it just seems to make more sense to me. It's like, oh, yes, logically, okay, this makes sense. I started doing past life regression work and understanding some of my past lives, which has been so interesting. It's like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense too. I can see that. Yeah.
yeah, that's a whole series of podcasts going into the past life regressions and learning
Yeah.
about our past lives and all that's so much potential for deep healing and deep work that can be done just in that. And it doesn't
Yeah.
require any psychedelic.
No?
Like past life regression meditations, you can find them on YouTube
Yeah.
pretty easily.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, they work. I've done quite a bit of exploration there myself. And
It's helped me understand
yeah,
some things that keep coming up in my lifetimes that I need to get serious about working through. And I feel like I'm still an infant in spirituality. Like I surround myself with these beautiful goddesses and gods and beautiful people. This community is just such an amazing, welcoming, loving community, especially here in Southern California. And I just eat it up. I just love it. But there's some things that I'm just like, huh, okay, that's new. I haven't heard that before. That one's interesting. I'm gonna have to study that a little deeper. But everything is just this learning, and it's just been so beautiful. So I'm grateful for Lisa, my partner, who's much more involved in that area and that can bring the ritual and spirituality and ceremony into our dying practice because it's something I honor and love, but I'm not ready to lead that. I'm ready to just participate and keep learning, and that's okay too.
yeah, and that's to me, that's one of the most beautiful things about the spiritual journey and being on this kind of spiritual path. Like, you never learn it all. There's
Mm-hmm.
always more. You can always go deeper. It never gets boring, not to
Mm,
me anyway. Especially if you're doing psychedelics,
yeah.
it never gets boring. And even
Yeah.
if you're just sitting in meditation and aren't using psychedelics,
Mm.
the universe is infinite and it's always expanding. So there's always more to explore. And yeah, I'm there with you. It brings me a certain degree of hope and just excitement to life, that there's always something more to explore. And even
Yeah.
if it's just sitting silently for an hour and observing where and how I'm getting discomfort, it's like, oh, there's
Mm-hmm.
something there.
Mm-hmm.
There's something there.
Yeah. And just it's helped me become curious. I was so programmed this right and wrong and this black and white and I overanalyzed to exhaustion. And it's lovely to be curious and to learn and to not have shame that I don't know the answers. Yeah. But the old Nicole shows up sometimes and then I have to remember it's okay to not know, or it's okay to still be in a learning place. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun to learn. And that's a
Mm.
mindset, like a way of approaching life. Like I'm
Yeah.
always willing to learn. I'm always willing to learn.
Yeah.
When I meet somebody who's very certain that they have all the answers, to me, that's an indicator of like, oh, that person most certainly does not have all the answers. And to pay special attention and be very discerning with whatever that person has to say.
Well,
Yeah,
and
so
I remember when I was like that, or I still like that. To me, they're mirroring me, right? It's like, no, I know I
mhm.
can still show up that way. And it's just
Yeah,
it's a little reminder to myself to stay out of that. And one, to stay out of judgment, but also stay out of the belief that I need to know it all. And so again, you mentioned something earlier, like these are all our best teachers, right? They're all here to teach us life lessons. And again, I want to learn as many of them as I can in this lifetime. I'm okay with being reincarnated. I'm sure I will be many more
yeah,
times before I ever become enlightened, but it's pretty fun learning them in this lifetime.
yeah. And like you said, if you don't get it in this one, there's always the next one or the one after that or the one
Exactly.
after that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I spent some time in India,
Mm.
and I lived in an ashram for like a month. And the culture there is so different. And just the pace of living, and like I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. I come from the US, so I grew up on a small farm in Minnesota, and it
Oh,
was
okay.
all work all the time.
Well,
There was very little downtime. And so it's just like programmed from a young age, go, 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 go.
yeah.
And it just was not that way.
Mhm.
And I don't know, it might have been Ram Dass actually talking about his time in India, because I consumed a lot of Ram Dass during that period of time
Mm.
of his material. And
Yeah.
he's like, well, yeah, just think about the culture. So there's no rush to get anywhere. There's no rush to get anything done. Because if you don't get it done in this lifetime, you just get it done the next lifetime.
I
It's like,
love it.
and then it clicked. I was like, oh, that is why nobody's in a hurry here.
Yeah.
And it's just baked into their culture.
Yeah.
Whereas in the United States, in our Western culture, there's this hustle, there's this go,
Mm.
there's this drive. There, it's just different. That pervading belief and just deep knowing of that reincarnation is real, and this isn't our first go around, and just that level of conscious awareness of that
Yeah.
all the time. It has a deep impact on the entirety of the culture. Which, when that clicked for me, I was like, okay,
Mm.
no wonder why everything is different here. They're just seeing the world through a
Yeah.
very different lens than I was brought up in.
And the lack of attachment, the materialism, just needing enough just to be healthy, to get by. And it's such a beautiful thing that we just don't have here. It's ingrained. I mean, I was raised that I know it was all about my career. It was all about traveling the world, proving I was enough, making as much money. I had 2 houses by myself. I didn't need a man. It was a lot of proving my worth and getting love because I couldn't give what my parents wanted, which was to stay in the religion, but I can give them money because they hadn't planned properly for retirement. I could prove I can give them a nice lifestyle. I can give nice vacations. I could wine and dine them. And that's what I did to prove I was enough. And so it wasn't truly until, matter of fact, psychedelics is what got me to sell my company and get out of financial services. It was like, no, you're going to take some time off to heal. And I spent a year traveling a couple of those months just in nature by myself in my Sprinter van. I would have never thought. My dad said to me in my first journey, he said, you can travel alone in your van. I'm always with you. From that day forward, I traveled alone. I had never traveled alone in my van. Yeah.
Oh, and it's, yeah, super, super beautiful that you're able to have that connection now
Mm.
that maybe wasn't available to you at one point while your father was alive. And that's something I don't think to you and me that makes sense, that when the person transitions out of their body, that we maintain a relationship with them, but it changes.
Right.
And I think of my grandfather, who I mentioned earlier, who passed suddenly when I was young. And in some aspects, I have a closer relationship with him, even though he's not here physically and hasn't been for many years. The quality, I'll put it this way, like the quality of my relationship with him is richer, or there's just like there's something there. There's like an added, like, I don't know, just gravity. Like, just the quality of our relationship is different than relationships with family members that are still alive. There's fewer barriers. When you're not in your body, you're not maintaining so many of the aspects of ego and your childhood programming and the role that you played while you were alive. That kind of falls away. And that connection becomes more clean, and there's less in between you. I guess that's maybe a way to describe that. And in having that, I think if more people understood that was available, and that the death process wasn't an ending of one thing, it was just shifting, and maybe even an opening up of a relationship that would not have been possible if while the person was alive.
That was my case.
That perspective, it might also alleviate some of that anxiety and worry around the death process.
Yeah. The first year of ayahuasca, the first time I did it, I waited a year, and super profound in a lot of heart-opening ways. And again, I connected with my parents there, but not as deeply until the second year. I went to Oregon and sat for 3 nights of medicine. I thought I had done some work around grieving my parents, but still pretty heady, even though improved a lot. So I get into ayahuasca, and the first night, the grandmother says to me, "You have not properly mourned the death of your parents." And she gave me 3 steps. You will mourn them, you will forgive them, let go of the anger and hate and this victimhood that you've been carrying around for all these years. And lastly, you will honor them every day. And that was about 2 weeks into my 2-month solo van trip. And I had, again, totally heady, I had the best hikes, the best mountain biking routes, like the best places to stand up paddleboard, right? I had my adventure van packed, right? From that moment on, I didn't even look at the places I thought I was going to go. It literally was, I was at a waterfall, and I would sit and I would cry and I'd meditate and I would honor and I would send them love, and I'd look around and I'd think about something that they would enjoy. Then I sat down with a medium and psychic. I was just volunteering at the spiritual event for James Von Prague, and I was running the mic that night. And all of a sudden, my grandmother came through, and he gives me the most beautiful reading. My mom came through too. But my grandma was somebody I was named after, and she died many years ago, but I didn't like my grandmother. She had a rough life. She really was kind of that victim. She really had a rough life. And she just wasn't a very nice woman. But I was named after her. My mom used to always say, "Oh, but you're named after grandma. You really need to work on your relationship with grandma." Grandma started coming through in the most beautiful way. And any time that I was doing honoring of my parents, grandma will come through and tell me, "And me too, and me too." And so I have the closest relationship I've ever had to my grandmother. And funny enough, she was the one that was the florist that always did flowers for our events. And so now here I am working with my girlfriend Lisa in our company, and I'm assisting her. And I just laugh because I think of just helping grandma as a little girl with flowers and how much love I had for that. So through ayahuasca, the mourning process, I didn't like the way that my parents were honored. And we did a Zoom, again, middle of COVID, did a Zoom memorial, and it was led by somebody that was in their church, right? So I didn't even cry. It wasn't my way. I wanted to honor them. Well, grandmother says to me during ayahuasca, "So fine, have your own celebration of life." So I did. I came home and I got my kids together in August, or a couple weeks after I got back from my van trip. And we had the most beautiful day of just honoring my parents and my grandmother, because she insisted. Which I probably had never really mourned and honored her either. And so that's become our annual celebration of life for them. And it was just so beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really touching and beautiful. And thank you for sharing that. And I know I have that relationship with my grandfather, and it's cool to hear somebody else who's got a similar kind of relationship, and somebody else's experience with that sort of us being in the physical and them not being physical, that kind of dynamic. I always love hearing other people's points of view and other people's perspective when it comes to, this kind of thing.
Yeah, they're still very present. It's just a matter of acknowledging it and really honoring them, having them on my altar, and really just sending love each day when I sit in meditation. It's been beautiful.
Yeah, I think, like you say, getting quiet, just meditation and with intention, something we talked about a little bit ago.
Yeah.
Being quiet and having that intention. And it's amazing what'll come through and what little voice you might hear in your head or what idea might pop into your head that could have only come from one person or is like very clearly assigned from one person. So
yeah.
Well, Nicole, this has been an awesome conversation. I'm so grateful for this time that we've got to chat and get to know each other better. And thank you so much for your service, for what you're doing.
Thank you.
For honoring that impulse and the knowing within yourself that you're here to do something different. I know taking a drastic career change when in the financial services aspect was all you knew for your whole life, and then just moving from that to what you're doing now, that's no small change. I celebrate you for that, and I see you, and that's your story is very beautiful, and I just intuitively know that the work that you do, you and Lisa, and EcoLove Transitions is going to have a resounding impact for all the people that you work with and for their families and for future generations, and just for people in your community, bringing a light to this subject and creating safe spaces like the dinners and the death cafes and just giving people opportunities to explore that aspect of life, because death and life are connected. They're not separate from each other.
They're not opposite.
They're two sides of the same coin. So giving people an opportunity to ask questions in a safe and comforting environment around the topic of death, I think is something that our culture will benefit greatly from. And I thank you very much for your time and for sharing. And if there's anything else you want to share before we leave off, any website, social media, whatever you have to plug, now's a great time for that.
Just EcoLoveTransitions.com. Yeah, just our website. And we're building out social media and some of the other things now. But for me, find your local crematory or Aqua-cremation, because to me, that's the one thing that we can start learning and spreading the word about, because I just think it's so beautiful and it's becoming more and more available. So, yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
But thank you. Thanks for all you do, too. It's just been such a pleasure getting to know you. I look forward to finding ways that we get to serve together. Yeah,
likewise. Just the beginning steps of a long and fruitful partnership and co-collaboration and whatever that looks like.
Awesome, Ian. Thank you. Thanks for all you do.
Yeah. Thank you. You're very welcome.